Thank you very much. Thank you.
Been a good day?
I've had a great week.
That's awesome. That's
He had a
awesome.
great niece born on his birthday yesterday.
Oh, that's all right. That's good. That's good. Good deal. Congratulations. Well, we're going to go ahead and pray, and we're going to get started here with our third week of our gospel study here. And we're going to go to the book of Matthew. So if you got your Bible, you can go ahead and turn to the book of Matthew. That's kind of where we're going to hang out tonight. And I'll recap just a little bit about where we were at last week. But let's go ahead and pray, and we can look at this just a second. Let's just bow our heads and just ask God to be with us. Father, we thank you. All right. So last week, just to recap real quick, we went through all four of the Gospels. And when I say Gospels, it's kind of a misnomer. Okay, so it's not really the Gospels. It's only one Gospel. All right, and that's what we talked about last week. Is there's only one Gospel. And the week before that, we talked about this word gospel is related to a Greek word, euangelion. Now, this Greek word basically meant a herald or an announcement. So it's like when there's a new king coming, you would have someone that would come out and announce this new king. Hear ye, the land of Richmond Hill has a new king. And so his kingdom is going to consist of free Dr. Pepper for everybody. Everybody gets free Wi-Fi. You'll live in peace. It's kind of what his kingdom is going to consist of. So that's what the gospel word really means. It is an announcement of a king's reign and what their kingdom is going to consist of. So when I say we're looked at the first four Gospels, that's really not correct, because there's only one Gospel. It's the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. So that's how it goes. And it can even be the Gospel according to Paul. And the Gospel is not just New Testament idea. The Gospel is an Old Testament idea, because Isaiah, the prophet, talked about the Gospel. So you could even talk about the Gospel according to Isaiah, which is not something that we typically think about. We don't typically think about the Gospel being an Old Testament thing, but it is. It is an announcement of a new kingdom. And that new kingdom has been coming for a long time. That new kingdom has been kind of promoted and promoted and announced. And the Old Testament prophets kept announcing. You can even go back to Genesis chapter 3. If you look at the fall narrative, even there you see this prophecy of Jesus, where it talks about, that the seed is going to crush the serpent's head. That's talking about that's a proclamation of a new king that's coming. All right, so it starts way back then. And this gospel works its way through Scripture, works its way through the Old Testament, and now we're in the New Testament. So we looked last week at a very large overview of the Gospels, the Gospel in the first four books. So we looked at Matthew, we looked at Mark, we looked at Luke, we looked at John. Does anybody remember who Luke was written to? I remember who Luke was written to. Luke was written to, he was a Gentile, he was a Greek, so he was writing to Greeks and writing to a mixed congregation. It was Greeks and Jews. When you get to John's gospel, John is writing to the Asian church. If you look at John, because he was the pastor to Asia, and so John is writing to this Asian church, and there's Jews and Gentiles in that. If you look at Mark, Mark was the gospel written to the Roman church specifically. So the Gospel of Mark is not so much to a Jewish congregation, but to a Gentile congregation, to a Greek-speaking congregation, and a very Roman mindset. How they thought about their gods, their culture, power. If you look at Mark, we talked about this, that when you're reading the book of Mark, just count how many times authority comes up. Authority here, authority here, authority. He had authority, took authority over the demons. And all this authority talk, why is that? Who's he writing to? He's writing to the Romans. And why does he need to contrast this authority of Jesus with the authority of who? Who's the Roman ruler? Caesar.
Yeah.
The Caesar. And actually, he's not just the Roman ruler, he's the Roman Empire, which would encompass Jerusalem, Israel. That would fall under Caesar's reign and rule. But specifically to this Roman church, that's what they think of. When they think of power, they think of Pax Romana. They think of Caesar ruling and keeping the peace by violence. They think of Caesar ruling and keeping the peace by fear. All right? So it's a very strong hand. And so what Mark does is he's contrasting this gospel of Jesus against the gospel of Caesar. Okay? So Mark is writing to a Roman church. But I want us to look, and we're going to look at it in depth at each book each week. So we're going to look at Matthew tonight. We'll look at Mark, Luke, and John over the next 3 weeks, and we'll wrap up. So Matthew, just the questions that I wrote down for tonight's study. Matthew would be who? Anybody know who Matthew was? Who is Matthew? I don't know what that is there. Yep, he is a what?
Tax collector.
He is a tax collector, right? He works for the Roman IRS. Do we like the IRS? It is not a trick question, right? Nobody really likes to pay taxes. But they really didn't like to pay taxes back then. And we'll talk about why that is here in just a second. So Matthew, if you look at Matthew's gospel starts out different than any of the other gospels. How is it different in its beginning? Anybody know?
Genealogy.
It has a genealogy. And what's a genealogy?
Family tree.
It's a family tree. Genealogy actually comes from the word we get Genesis. And so Genesis means what? In the beginning. That's what it says, in the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning. So if Genesis means beginning, genealogy is a word that talks about origins and it talks about beginnings. So Matthew starts the gospel that he is telling, his version of the gospel and his eyewitness account with a genealogy. And what he does is he is trying to connect Jesus with Abraham. And if you remember last week we talked about the genealogy, that if you look at that genealogy, you could break it up into 3 sections. And so the first section, he connects to Abraham. So it's 14 generations in each section. So when he starts with Abraham and he goes through Abraham to get to the next one is David. So he says, I'm trying to connect Jesus with Abraham, with David, through these 14 generations. Or 3 sets of 14 generations. Okay? Now, it is a bad genealogy in that it's bad in a lot of different ways. Because he leaves some people out, and there's some people that he highlights. And I've talked about this here at the church quite a bit over the last few years. What makes this genealogy that Matthew includes different from most genealogies? Does anybody know? What is it, young lady?
Women.
What?
Women.
Women! Women in the genealogy make this different because women weren't included in genealogies. Sorry, ladies. But in this time, in this culture, it's a very patristic, patriarchal, totally butchered that word. It's not patristic culture where it's male-driven. It's about the fathers. And so all they want you to know is who the father was. But Matthew doesn't do that. Matthew doesn't stick with tradition. Matthew goes outside of tradition because Matthew has an agenda. And Matthew's agenda, if you remember, is not just to tell the story of Jesus. It's not just to tell, well, this is what happened. Matthew is not just giving you information. All right? If you want information, it's like, go read an encyclopedia, go read a dictionary. Matthew has an agenda. And every writer of the first 4 books has an agenda. So that's what we're going to talk about. So what's Matthew's agenda? If Matthew has an agenda, what is it? And he starts off in a very Jewish way. So who is Matthew writing to? He's writing to Jews. He starts off with a Jewish. He starts off with a Jewish genealogy.
I thought you said he was speaking to them.
Not Matthew. Not Matthew. Mark and Luke. The rest of these guys will speak to Gentiles. But Matthew's gospel is geared, whoosh, kind of a laser beam at Jews. Because everything, you see how he tells, he retells the gospel, or he tells his side of the story is very Jewish. The pictures and allusions and a lot of Old Testament passages are going to be used in the book of Matthew because he is speaking to a Jewish congregation. So Matthew is a Jew. Does anybody know what his other name is? Anybody know? I'll give you extra points. You get a gold star if you make it this one. I got plenty of gold stars. Anybody remember this? Levi. Levi. Anybody, you've never heard him called Levi? All right, so Levi is a very Jewish name, right? What does Levi, anybody think, what does it make you think of when you think of Jewish? Leviticus. The Levites. Who were those people? Those were the people who took care of the temple, right? So that's a very Jewish name, all right? So Matthew is a Jew, and he is writing to Jews. So Matthew is Jewish, and he's writing to Jewish people. Now, Matthew gets his name changed. So he is known by his Jewish name Levi, but he gets, if you go look at Matthew chapter 9, he tells this story. Let's read it. Let's go to Matthew chapter 9 and look at this real quick. Because here we go. Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. And it says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew. Did I get myself? I don't think I gave myself. I did not do it. So he saw a man called Matthew. Now, if you go look at Mark and Luke's account, they refer to Matthew by his Jewish name, Levi. All right? And Matthew is a Jewish name, but they believe that Matthew is more of a play on words. That he became Matthew from Levi because a disciple, the word disciple, and that's what everybody was to become, right? You're to become a disciple of Jesus. Well, that word, disciple, in the Greek, is mathetes. Mathetes. So it's like a play on the word Matthew. It's almost like he's saying, you know what? It's almost like remember when Peter, what did they change Peter's name to? He said, you are called Peter, but I'm going to call you.
I'm gonna be wrong again. That's Simon?
So it's Simon Peter, right? Simeon. He says, you're a little rock, but he says, I want to make you a great rock. Don't they have a way of just changing people's names in the Bible? Have you seen that? Where that names get changed? This is kind of what we see happening here, where he is Levi, but he is going to be known as Matthew. And as he tells his story here in this, he says, Jesus was passing by and he saw a man called Matthew, or disciple, sitting at the tax booth. Now this is a little bit kind of janky. It doesn't match up because the tax collector wouldn't have really been thought of as a disciple, okay? They were thought of as sinners. And so Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me, and he rose and followed him. And Jesus reclined at the table in the house, and behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? It's synonymous. If you're a tax collector, you're obviously a sinner, right? If you're a tax collector, you're obviously a sinner. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second. But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners. So Matthew gets his name changed, and that's important. So Matthew is Jewish, and he's writing to Jews. Okay? So Matthew is Jewish, and he's writing to Jews. So I've got to share a little bit of information with you tonight, and I don't want to be, I'm not trying to be crude, I'm not trying to be offensive, but there's a term I want to share with you. The term mumser. Anybody ever heard of the term mumser?
Only last Wednesday.
Only last Wednesday. So the term mumser, let me give you what the term mumser means. And actually it can be spelled two different ways. It can be mumser or mamser. Actually, if you looked it up, you would probably find it more spelled mamser. Okay? So, mumser. This is the definition of mumser. A mumser is a child born of a forbidden sexual union, although commonly translated as a, excuse my French, bastard. The term if you look at Jewish law, a mamzer can only marry another mamzer or a convert. All right. So if you were a Jewish man, you could not marry a woman who had had an illegitimate child, because what's going to happen is this: all your line from that point on, they become outsiders forever. There's no coming back. That's Jewish law. That's how you would be seen. So a mamzer is someone who traditional Jewish law prohibits a mamzer from marrying into the Jewish community. A restriction that poses a significant ethical quandary, since the mamzer is effectively punished for a crime they didn't commit. All right, so if you're the child, right, of this illegitimate relationship, it's not your fault, right? It doesn't matter. You're cast out, and now your children are cast out. Your children's children can't become part of the community. Do you see how that is a big deal? And so lineage is a big deal to Jews. Lineage is if I was going to tell you, if you came into my office, if you walked over to my office tonight and you'd come in there and you would see some pictures up on the wall. There'd be some things that you would see. You would see 3 certificates of my ministerial credentials, where I started at the level of exhorter. I went to the next level of ordained minister. Then I became a bishop in the Church of God at the last stage of my ministerial credentialing. You'll also see another certificate on that wall that says that I received a Bachelor of Science degree in pastoral ministry from Lee University. And so that's up there. And so when you walk into a doctor's office, what do you see displayed? They have their credentials, right? They have their pedigree. Oh, this is where I went to school. This is where I got my education. It's kind of a big deal, right? It's if you went to school, you know, those are good things. A lineage is somebody's pedigree. It's the kind of stuff that would be hanging on their wall. It's not literally, but that's the kind of stuff they would want you to know. If you go look at Paul writes in one of his letters, he says, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. I'm from this line. I'm a Pharisee of the Pharisees. And he begins to recount all that. And he gets down and he says, but I count it all rubbish. I count it all as a loss. And so what Matthew is doing, he's saying, hey, all these Jews that you know how big of a deal that a lineage is, I want to tell you the lineage of Jesus. And the lineage of Jesus, just like you mentioned a while ago, is how he presents it is not traditional because it includes who? What? What did you say? Includes women. And who are these women that it includes? Well, it includes a person named Tamar. Anybody know who Tamar is? Who's Tamar? Who's Tamar?
She was the daughter of David, and wasn't she the one that got raped?
Okay,
By her
that
brother?
that is a Tamar. I'm talking about this. This is. You were doing good, but you're right. Don't feel bad. Don't feel bad because you're right. You're right. You know that. It's just a different Tamar. That's not bad. That's not bad. But this Tamar, it precedes her. All right. This Tamar precedes her when you get to the sons, the 12 sons, and the son Judah. Now, anybody ever heard of the son of Jacob? His name is Judah. All right. So Judah is one of Jacob's sons, and Judah goes and has an illicit relationship. He goes down to the temple shrine and finds a temple prostitute and basically has a relationship with her. What he doesn't know is that his daughter-in-law has masqueraded herself as a temple prostitute. And so Judah has a sexual relationship with Tamar, his daughter-in-law. Sounds like Jerry Springer, doesn't it? All right? This is messed up. And so she has 2 sons, and two children come out of this relationship. Well, what are those children? Those children are who? Mumsers. All right? They become mumsers. So what is Matthew doing? It's not good. You would not put the black sheep of the family as your, hey, this is who we want to look like. It's kind of the outcast of the family. Maybe you got family members like, oh, we don't talk about Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob's kind of he's in the background. That's not who you want to include here in the lineage. But what Matthew does is he does include. He includes Tamar. That's the first one he includes. Wow, a very sordid story. Has mumsers as she produces mums. So it's a relationship of incest. You get on down, and who's the next one? Anybody, if you're looking at it, who's the next one? Rahab. All right. Who's Rahab? Anybody know who Rahab is? Remember the story of Rahab? Rahab she wasn't even Jewish. She was a Canaanite. Right? And she was a prostitute. A Canaanite prostitute. And what she does is she allows the spies to come into the city of Jericho, right? She says, hey, listen. Yeah, she threw the cord out the window. And she allows the spies to come in and says, listen, when you take the city, just take care of me and my family. And so she gets drawn into the community of Israel in that way because of what she does. But she's originally a Canaanite prostitute. And she is included into the lineage of Jesus. So Tamar, Rahab, who's next? Anybody know? You see another? Ruth. There you go. Good. Ruth. Now, what's Ruth's story? Ruth is not a prostitute or anything like that. Actually, Ruth is a beautiful story. But what's the problem with Ruth? Anybody know where she came from? She came, huh?
Moab.
She came from Moab. So let me read you. Deuteronomy chapter 23, beginning in verse 2. So, no one born of a forbidden come to God's presence. That's a big deal, guys. That's a big deal. So no one born of a forbidden union she's from Canaan. I think I misspelled that too. There we go. Fix it. She's from Canaan. From Moab, from Canaan. Wow, there's a lot of dirty laundry in this genealogy. Matthew, what are you doing? Doesn't sound like he's trying to do Jesus any favors, does he? It'd be like me coming and saying, tell you what, I want to tell you, I'm going to give you your ancestry, but I'm only going to talk about the bad ones, okay? The ones that were murderers, the ones that were snakes, the ones that were, in jail, the ones that were, all those. That's the only ones we're going to talk about. Would you want me to talk about your relatives then? Like, let's just skip it, right? Well, it seems like that's what he's doing. He's really pulling up these women, which is not what they usually do. And then the ones that he's pulling out, man, they have a sordid story. Who's next? So we have Tamar, we have Rahab, we have Ruth. Who else? There's another one. She's actually not named by name. Uriah's wife. She doesn't even get called by name. Who is Uriah's wife? Anybody remember? Bathsheba, who had an affair with David and produced a mamzer. Because that child was born out of an illegitimate relationship. Wow. So, what's this? There's mamzers all through Jesus' genealogy. Why is Matthew concerned with this? Why is this a big deal to Matthew? Remember, Matthew, his name was Levi, but what was his occupation? Tax collector. Let me read you a little bit about the tax collectors. Who were the tax collectors? The tax collectors, so he didn't work for like Israel. They weren't the ones collecting taxes. Who did he work for? He worked for the Romans. So we hate the Romans. Is that right? We don't like the Romans. The Romans are our rulers. They are our oppressors. And so Matthew, or Levi, is working for them. And so what he's doing is he's coming to all our Jewish relatives and our families, and he had to pay to be a tax collector. So he paid a fixed amount to be a tax collector. But what they would do is they would charge over and above that. So if the taxes he had to collect was 10%, he would collect 20%. That's just that's not even. Actually, it's probably more. They would collect more like 40% tax. Now, can you imagine if you had a cart full of supplies and stuff that you had bought or you're getting ready to sell, and then Matthew comes by, oh, what you got in the cart here? Well, looks like I'm going to have to take this, and I'm going to take this, and I'm going to take this for the tax. And so he gets what he needs for the Roman government, but now he's thinking in his head, yeah, I'm going to need this too, and this, and this, and this. And you're like, half my cart's gone. There's nothing left, right? Can you see why people would hate the tax collectors? Can you see why people would hate if somebody come up to you and said, you know what? It's going to cost you, guys, walking in this building, it's going to cost you $20, you know, for the church is charging you $20. So, you know what, Pastor Ryan, I got to get my $20 too. So now it's going to cost you $40 to get in here. You're like, what in the world, right? And people hated the tax collectors. That's why they're synonymous, tax collectors and sinners. Let me read you. This is how the Romans chose tax collectors. Okay, this is how Romans chose tax collectors. Tax collector. Greater detail. There was a writer by the name of Philo, and Philo wrote. He says, "Who gives the voice of the Jewish tradition of hatred of those who place themselves outside the law, and provides a vivid image of why tax collectors were so hated by the provincial population unable to protect themselves." This is what the Romans looked for. The Romans deliberately chose as tax collectors men who are absolutely ruthless and savage. That's who when they went to go recruit, they're looking for men who are, they're ruthless, man. They're taking every last dime. They use, man, see that old lady over there who she only had like $10 and he took every bit of her $10? That's who we want as a tax collector. That's how they recruited. So they absolutely, they chose men who were absolutely ruthless and savage and gave them the means of satisfying their greed. These people who were mischief makers by nature gained added immunity because of their superior orders. They had a thing called superior orders. So my job, you can't refuse me. You can't say no, I'm not paying that. That's not an option, right? It's not an option. You have to pay it. So I have superior orders. And so in everything where their masters were concerned, they leave undone no cruelty of any kind and recognize no equity or gentleness. These were not good guys. So Matthew is a skunk. He's a dog. He's the lowest of the low. Levi. Doesn't sound like a disciple, does he? So why is this important for Matthew? Why is it that when Jesus comes by in Matthew 9, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called, let's just say, if it was Mark and Luke telling the story, he saw a man called Levi, a Jewish man who's a tax collector. He's a sinner. He's the lowest of the low. Jesus saw him. And sitting at the tax booth, he said to him, Jesus ain't supposed to be talking to him. But he comes up, and Matthew realizes he's Jesus, this rabbi, this person who is talking all this kingdom talk about community, comes up to Matthew. He's like, he's probably about to cuss me out. He's probably about to point his finger in my face and tell me how bad I am. He's probably about to, and what does Jesus do? He does the exact opposite. He says, hey, follow me. That didn't happen. See, you had to be chosen by a rabbi. You couldn't choose a rabbi. You couldn't say, hey, I want to come be your follower. No, the rabbi had to tap you. He had to see that you were worthy to follow him. It's almost like trying to get into some prestigious college. You know, you don't just walk up and say, hey, I'd like to be in Harvard. Okay, I've showed up. I am from Georgia, and I am here to enroll in Harvard. I did not finish high school. I do not have a diploma of any kind. I can't count. I can't read or write. But you know what? I want to be a student here at Harvard. What are they going to do? They're going, you're not coming to Harvard, all right? Right, yeah, you need to go. You need to go somewhere else, right? But Jesus sees this person who is unqualified to follow a rabbi, and what does he say? Hey, Matthew or Levi, follow me. What? What'd you just say? Levi, come follow me. What do you mean? I want you, Levi, to come follow me and learn from me and be part of my crew, be part of my community. Matthew didn't have a community. Matthew chose his side a long time ago. He was an outcast from his community. Think about that. Can you think of anybody right now in your brain that maybe has become an outcast? Who are people who have become outcasts in their communities? You know, people who, oh man, you just made some bad life choices. You can't come home. There's no place for you here. That's where Matthew is at. He didn't have a home. He didn't have a community. It wasn't like his family was saying, well, Matthew, welcome home from collecting all those taxes. No, when Matthew chose to be a tax collector, whatever led him there, it was a choice to be excluded from the rest of the Jewish community. He swapped sides. And so for the longest time, everybody says, you're not part of us. You're not one of us. You're not part of my family. And maybe if you could even think where his dad might have said, you're no son of mine. You're not my kid anymore. How devastating that would be. How devastating. And can you think about how devastated you would be if you didn't have the people that is your family? The people you go home to that make home what it is? Think about that. That's where Matthew was at. He didn't have a place to go. So he might as well get as much as he could from the money. He might as well make as much money as he could. He didn't have people to spend it with. He didn't have people to hang out. He didn't have a family to go home to. But Jesus walks by and looks at us and says, Levi, hey, come follow me. Come follow me. You know why Levi's story includes Manzers, Mumsers? Who are all these people? All these people are outsiders. All these people shouldn't have a community. All those people should not have a place in the assembly because law says so. But what does Jesus do? Why is this agenda? What is Matthew's agenda? Matthew's agenda is this. Jesus is bringing about a new king. The gospel of Matthew is the king has come and he's flipped everything upside down. There's a new king. There's a new king that says, you know what? I can have a place. There's a new kingdom where I can be part of that kingdom. I don't have to be out forever. Can you imagine how revolutionary that is? Can you imagine when we say, what is the gospel? The gospel is good news. Who's it good news for? It's good news for the outsiders. It's good news for the Mumsers, they were born into it. I didn't have a choice. This is what my family line is, so I didn't have a choice. I'm an outsider. I can't change that. Well, you know what? Jesus can. Jesus invites you to come follow him. Jesus invites you just like he did Levi. And that's why is the theory that Levi, the very Jewish name, actually becomes Matthew, Mathetas, disciple. Because he changes. His entire trajectory of his life changes. How big is that? How big is that? So when Matthew gets a chance to say, I got to write this down. What's Matthew's story? Matthew's story is, this was me. Jesus took a Mumser and made him a Matthew. Jesus took a Mumser and made him a Mathetas. Made him a disciple. Made him part of the community. Invited him back in. Gave him a family. Gave him a place to land. That's what Matthew's about. Because if you go through if you're going through Matthew, and Matthew is going out of his way not to prove the purity of the Messiah's bloodline. So he didn't use this genealogy to prove, look how pure Jesus is. He did the exact opposite. He showed all the bad sides. So Matthew is going out of his way not to prove the purity of the Messiah's bloodline, but the messiness of it. Because this is a Messiah who understands the messiness of life. When you read Matthew's gospel, you begin to see the one who doesn't belong on every page. When you read through Matthew, begin to see everybody who doesn't belong, and Jesus is engaging them. Who do you find? You find the leper. You find the Roman. You find the Gentile woman. You find the demoniac in Decapolis. You find the blind men. You find the bleeding woman, the woman with the issue of blood. You find the people who are unclean, the pagan outcasts, the rejected, and the despised around every corner of Jesus' ministry. When you look at Matthew, it's littered with mumsers and outcasts. What's Matthew's agenda? What do you think? Where did he start? He started with a messed up genealogy to declare, what is the Evangelion? It's a declaration of a new king and the type of kingdom that that new king brings. The Gospel of Matthew is a declaration that the mumser can become a Matthias, that the mumser can become a Matthew, that Levi can become Matthew. That's what it's about. What do you think? How does that strike you? I mean, what do you think people, as they're hearing Matthew, if they're reading Matthew's gospel, how is this appealing? Who's it appealing to? Why would it be appealing? Have you ever felt like an outsider? How do outsiders become insiders? Anybody know? How do outsiders, if you're on the outside, you're not in the group, and you want to be in the group, how do outsiders become insiders?
Someone in the group accepts you.
Exactly. You have to have somebody who's inside say, come on in. And Jesus, what does he do? When Jesus says stuff like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. When Jesus says stuff like, I am the door. What door? I'm the door to allow you back in. You've been out. You're a mumser. You're outside. I'm inviting you to come in. Isn't that, if you're reading through the Gospels with us, or the Gospels, I keep saying that, that's bad for me. I'm trying to change that. It's been such a habit, but going through this study has really, it's the gospel. So when you read the gospel in these different places, and you see where Jesus is just, he's kind of turning things on its head. People he's not supposed to talk to. People he's not supposed to engage with. You know, kicks those doors open and allows them to come in. So that's Matthew. That's what we have. Any questions, comments? Good. We are done about 10 minutes early. So that's kind of how you can look. And I wanted to give you this kind of this overarching view that when you're reading this, when you're reading Matthew, go back and read Matthew and see if some of this doesn't stand out to you. Oh. Well, I bet that person was on the outside. They're demon-possessed, you know, and Jesus freed them, right? We don't normally invite demon-possessed people to be part of our in-crowd, right? We wouldn't really do that. But what does Jesus do? He releases them. He frees them, you know, and he makes them something different. He changes their story, changes their names, changes their destination. I love that. Man, I love that idea. And I just... When I think about that, and I think about the times that I've been on the outside, growing up, I had bad self-esteem problems in high school. Just I wouldn't talk to people, wouldn't really look people in the eye, you know, because I always thought everybody was better than me. I was never part of the in-group, in-crowd, anything like that. And so that really messed with me. I just didn't do a lot of things. I didn't play sports at school. I would play sports, but it was always, you know, maybe at the rec department or something like that, and when I had some church friends that were going to play. But for me, at school, that was one of those places I just felt like an outsider because I didn't think I was good enough. And it was about 18. My dad was a pastor. I really began to try to make this my faith and not just the faith that they had, you know, because you have to do that. You have to actually own it at some point. It has to become yours and not just your parents, right? So that's why I'm praying that Pastor Trent over there is helping these kids learn how to own their faith. I had to really begin to look at that, and I remember it was in Peter. I began to read in Peter where he talks about you are a chosen priesthood. You're a royal nation. You're special. And it began to kind of, I quit trying to think, God, what does everybody else think about me? God, what do you think about me? That changed me. That changed me. Because it didn't matter really. It began on the inside of me, in my brain and in my heart, began to shift to caring what everybody else thought about me, to really saying, God, what do you think about me? Jesus, what do you think about me? That's what happened to Matthew. He says, Matthew, this is what I think about you. I think you're better than what everybody says you are. Because I know who created you. I know how they created you. And so when we get a picture of that, it changes us. It's changed me. I never would have thought, I would not have stood up and talked to a room full of people. Not this many people, not the many people that we talked to on Sunday morning, not the chance. I had the chance of preaching at youth camps and stuff. I wouldn't have done that at all before I gave my heart to Christ. So that changed everything about my life. It changed the whole trajectory of my life and where I'm going. I think that's the great thing about the gospel in Matthew. So we'll look at Mark. I will say this: if you go read, there's a lot of scholars who believe that Mark is the earliest gospel written. People that I've been reading lately, I tend to agree with them, but I think Matthew is probably the earliest gospel written. What most scholars believe is that Mark was the earliest gospel written, and that Matthew and Luke pulled from Mark. I don't necessarily subscribe to that anymore. I think when you begin to see Matthew telling his story, who's he telling it to? He's telling it to the Jews, and he's an eyewitness. All right? So Luke wasn't an eyewitness. Luke interviewed eyewitnesses. Mark interviewed people who hung out with Jesus. Matthew, eyewitness. He was called by Jesus. I tend to think that it's the other way. That if anything gets used as a source, it's Matthew. It's just me. Okay, let's pray and I'll let you go. Father, thank you, Lord.